Welcome. Welcome to this Healthy Leaders event. My name is Holly Holt-Wohl. I am an adjunct professor here at Luther Seminary. I teach the course with the longest name in the course catalog. The course is this: Ministry with Persons with Mental Illness and Their Families. So for 6 years I have been boldly proclaiming that the body of Christ has mental illness and it's okay. So I am part of the care team here at Luther Seminary, made up of the campus pastor, Laura Thielander, our interim parishioners, Karen Treat, and everybody who has the name student officially in their title. Carrie Carroll, Jeff Kringle, and Krista Lund. And so we work together to try and figure out how can we best serve the community as a whole. And one of the things we're focusing on this year is wholeness. What does it mean to be a whole leader and to think about all of our life? We here in academia are very good about loving the Lord God with all our mind. But sometimes we forget about our heart and soul and bodies. So we're focusing on wholeness. And this event is brought to us by the Hulme Endowment for Pastoral Care and Mental Health. This is a fund that was just created last year. Bill Hulme was a pastoral care professor here at Luther Seminary many years ago, and that enough would be the reason to establish this fund, but he had a psychotic, depressive episode at age 70, found himself in a catatonic state, hospitalized, had electronic convulsive therapy sessions, and so he and his wife Lucy went on this personal journey of mental illness. And so they, both being educators, she used to be a professor of English at a community college. They wanted to establish something for students and for learners and for leaders in the areas of pastoral care and mental health. And just here's a short description of the fund so you can hear what this is about. The purpose of this fund is to support curricular and extracurricular efforts at Luther Seminary. These educational contributions should help create basic competence in church leaders around mental illness and its related issues. It also should be used to help pastors live and minister from a base of emotional resilience, particularly when leading change. Which is what brings us to our speaker today, Dr. Henry Emmons, and his work. Henry is a psychiatrist, but we don't hold that against him, who seeks to use integrative, different methods and disciplines in his ministry. It is a ministry that you're up to. And he is a co-founder, I think, of Partners in Resilience and a partner in this group where he works to help persons use the basic resilience skills that they have and to highlight those. He has a couple of books out. The Chemistry of Calm is a book about anxiety and stress in one's life, and The Chemistry of Joy, where he seeks to work on this. So we are delighted to welcome him here today when he speaks to us on the science of hope, blending science and wisdom to sustain a healthy mind, mood, and heart. Let us join in welcoming Henry.
Is it okay if I stand down there too, like you did?
It's up to you.
Is it up to me? Okay. All right. Well, let me start by sharing with you some of my Lutheran credentials. Okay, I want to establish some credibility. So I went to Luther College. Anybody here a Luther College grad? At least a couple. Great. So I'm a Luther grad, and I went to medical school sort of against my own wishes, my own will, simply because I didn't know any better at the time. But what I really loved at Luther and later were the humanities. That was what I was really interested in. And there were 3 separate times in my medical training when I tried my best to leave medical training and go to seminary. There were 2 times during medical school, and at that time in my life, I just wasn't able to push past the disapproval of my parents who really wanted me to be a physician. And then when I went to the University of Rochester in upstate New York for my psychiatry training. And while I was there, I actually did quit my psychiatry training after 2 years, and I started at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. And I did that for 1 semester and found myself gravitating toward classes on Jungian psychology and family systems. And so I realized, okay, maybe the psychiatry thing is not such a bad fit for me, but I was always interested in trying to blend the spiritual side of things. During my entire 4 years at Rochester, I was in spiritual direction. I started training to be a spiritual director, which I never finished, but loved that. I think it has just tremendous amount of value. And then in my my career, I've managed to find ways to blend my interests, to do the kind of work that I think I always was meant to do and love to do, and just do it in a different sort of way. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. I think it's really fabulous that you are taking on this interest in promoting healthy church leaders. I'm sure it's no huge surprise to you that there are many people within the clergy, working within the church, who struggle with stress-related conditions, who struggle with keeping their own resilience up and healthy levels. And it's really not that different in my world either. Within healthcare, healthcare professionals are by no means immune to these same problems. And I think there is something about being in some of these professions in this day and age, with the combination of demands and expectations, maybe not having quite as much control or autonomy over one's life as one had thought, and maybe not having quite enough time or giving quite enough time to taking good care of oneself. But I think that this combination of things is pushing on people's resilience. It's eroding that natural capacity that we all have to be able to stay healthy and afloat no matter what sort of stresses are impinging upon us. That's how I think of resilience. It's a totally natural thing. It's a capacity everybody has, but there are things that tend to take it away or at least put a downward pressure on it. And that's what I want to try to focus on today by framing it with what I call the science of hope. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of silliness. There's probably people in this room who are too young to know what this picture is, but this is a scene from a movie called City Slickers that did come out 20 or more years ago, but it was with Billy Crystal, and the cowboy here is played by Jack Palance. In this movie, Billy Crystal was a neurotic, young, middle-aged guy from the city who was simply lost in the early phase of his middle age. And so his friends were encouraging him to go to a dude ranch where they figured he could find some answers. So he goes there and then meets this cowboy character who does lead them to believe that he's got the answer. So throughout the movie, he's talking about that there is one thing you can do. One thing. And he keeps using his finger and waving it at him, but he won't tell them what it is. So as you go through the movie, they're increasingly frustrated trying to get to this one thing. And at the end here, Billy Crystal has him alone, and he's just pestering him like he does so well, and he's breaking him down, so he's just about to reveal the secret. And then he has a heart attack and dies. So he doesn't find out from him. I am going to reveal to you the one thing that you can do during the course of this talk. I haven't had a heart attack and fallen over yet, so I am counting on that. So you be listening. Very good. There's an author that probably most of you recognize, In fact, this is an anniversary, I think, for the movie Gone with the Wind. Sometime this week, is it the 75th anniversary, something like that? The most watched movie ever. And the author of that book was attributed this quotation. She said, "Every problem has two handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear or the handle of hope." And the problem that I want to frame here is what I call the erosion of resilience. Now, I'm a psychiatrist. Probably 80 or 90% of the people that I work with are struggling with either depression or anxiety. They are incredibly common, and they can happen to anybody. But what I want to point out is that they have become far more common in the last few decades than they used to be. The epidemiology on this, the best research I'm aware of, has been done for 100 years now. Every time the U.S. Census is done, so every 10 years, there is a snapshot of the mental health of the United States population. It's a sampling of people in our country, and so we've got from 1910 through 2010, we've got all these different 10-year snapshots. And what we see is that the rates of depression and anxiety in our country have increased by about 10% every decade, every time it's been measured. Another way of looking at this, there's a really well-known psychologist that if you study psychology, you've probably heard of. His name is Martin Seligman. He's known for positive psychology. And he says it this way. He says, if you're born after World War II, so most everybody in our country now, if you're born after World War II, your chances of developing depression are about 10 times higher than if you'd simply been born at the turn of the last century. So within 50 to 70 years, we've seen some really significant change that we don't fully understand what's driving it. Now, most people aren't aware of this, but depression rates as the number one reason for disability in this country. Of all healthcare problems, depression is the most likely reason why somebody can no longer work. And that's been true in the United States, and it's actually been true in a lot of developed countries for quite a while now. But it's not been the case in the rest of the world, especially the developing world. Their rates of severe depression have been much, much lower. That is quickly changing. The World Health Organization says that within probably 10 years or so, they expect depression to be the number one cause of disability worldwide. So something is changing also in the developing world in relation to mental health. Now, we don't really know why this is the case, but I think that there are a lot of reasons for it, that a lot of things that have shifted in how we live, how we eat, and how we move our bodies, and the amount of sleep and other self-care that we do, that's really, really different from about 2 or 3 generations ago. I also think that there's a big difference in the way that we connect and communicate with one another, the way that we live in communities or feel like we belong to something greater than ourselves. I think that we've really seen a shift for that, and I think you experience that in the world of the church, that there isn't as strong a sense of affiliation or connection for many people as there has been historically. And I think the things that used to hold people together, that used to support them when things were really difficult, are just not there in the same way that they have been historically. So this slide is a reminder to me that this is not just about depression or recovery from depression. And I want to share a little bit of a personal story with you. I already told you that I kind of struggled through my medical training. I wasn't doing what I really wanted to do or what I thought, I wasn't really able to devote myself to it. So I had a lot of resistance as I went through, and it continued for a few years after I finished my training, to the point that I just really got depleted. It's hard to keep pushing like that. especially in a field as challenging as the one I'm in, if you're not really into it. And I after a while, as a psychiatrist, I found myself doing what all psychiatrists seem to do now, which is basically doing crisis management and medication management. And it's not very satisfying. At least it wasn't for me. And so I reached a point kind of early in my career where I was burned out, and you might say I was depressed or I was depleted. However you look at that, I was certainly not happy. And I needed to find a different way to do this. So what I did was to take time off. I took a sabbatical year, actually half-time over 2 years. I had the good fortune of that being supported by the Bush Foundation, so I was able to get kind of a graceful transition, if you will. But during that time, I began to immerse myself in the kinds of things that I'm doing now, which are natural therapies for mental health problems and mindfulness practices. And then the third thing was to to really try to learn about how to help other health professionals renew themselves so they could continue in a lifetime of service. So those were my three themes. That last theme was really important to me because I knew I wasn't the only one in the position I was in. And so I studied for a good long time with Parker Palmer. Some of you probably know Parker and his work, which I think is just really a wonderful way of working with people who are in this, have this desire to be more fully alive in their work. So those are the things I worked with, and I was really trying to get my handle around this thing that we call depression in a different way. And the night before, I was to give a whole day workshop. I was leading a workshop. I was speaking the whole day on this topic. The night before that, this is about 10, 12 years ago, I was driving my son, who was 13, and we were going to a soccer game for him. I stopped at a stop sign and I saw a car ahead of me with this quote on its bumper sticker. It said, "Surely joy is the condition of life." And that was not my experience at that moment. So what I thought to myself is, this doesn't sound true to me. And then I thought, what was Thoreau smoking at Walden Pond when he wrote this? And then I turned to my son and I said, I want you to read this and tell me what you think it means. So he did, and he got quiet for a little while, which was fabulous as a father. I wasn't expecting much out of him, but he did get quiet. He thought about it, and then he says, well, maybe he's saying that we could try harder to be happy. I like that notion out of a 13-year-old kid. I don't really think that's what Thoreau meant, but I do like the concept that, well, there are probably things we could do that make a difference in our day-to-day experience, and I think it's absolutely true. But I've come to see this quote by Thoreau as pointing us toward a great truth, even though I couldn't see it at the time, and many of us can't see it from time to time. But I think that he is telling us that there is some underpinning in our world and in our lives that is always there, and it is much more reliable and sustaining than the condition of happiness. Happiness I think of as more of a fleeting thing. It's a good thing, but I think of it as more of a feeling or an emotion, whereas I think joy is really enduring, and I don't think it's referring to our momentary and fluctuating feelings. So I want to give you an example that I think points to what this might really mean. About 4 years ago, when my second book came out, I was giving a book signing for that, and that was a book around anxiety. But as I was doing that book signing, a woman came and said, I want to thank you for your first book, and I want to tell you my story. So we go off to the side, and she says, 2 years ago, my daughter died, and I got horribly depressed. And I'm thinking, of course, it's hugely sad to lose a child. Depression, grief, they're sometimes hard to distinguish from one another, but she went on to explain that her daughter was 4 years old, and this woman had never before experienced depression, but for a good year after her daughter's death, she couldn't function. She couldn't do her job as a lawyer, as a parent, as a homemaker. And she tried getting on medication, she tried psychotherapy, she just wasn't getting better. And so some friends gave her this book to read, and she said, in reading this book, I started to be able to reconnect with the joy that was my daughter's life. I want to tell you more about my daughter, she said. We knew she would not survive childhood when she was born. She lived longer. She lived to be 4. That was longer than we expected by a year or 2. She had a horrible congenital illness. She was never able to speak a word, she said. She could never communicate in any way that children normally do. And yet, her presence in our lives was so vital and so amazing, and she just had this way of being with us that when she died, I was just completely bereft. And then she said, it's not like I don't feel that anymore. It hasn't gone away. I still do, but now I'm able to carry that sense of loss in one hand. And in the other hand, I can carry a sense of gratitude and joy that she was with us as long as she was. To me, that's a really authentic description of joy. It does not mean we feel a certain way. It doesn't mean we don't struggle with really difficult things, but there's something else there that can sustain us or that we can at least tap into. And it's more than one-sided. So back to resilience. I have this notion, this is just a concept in my own mind, that each of us carries a container like this in our brain or in our bodies that keeps us resilient in the way I described earlier. And I do believe that genetics makes a difference, and early childhood, how you're brought up, there's the sense of security, how you feel about yourself, makes a difference in this. So I do think that there are people who have a much bigger capacity, and there are others that have a much smaller capacity for withstanding stressful things in our lives. But I've also seen people who have a huge amount of natural resilience, but as life goes on, there's enough things that happen, enough losses, enough challenges that anybody can get depleted and can develop the kind of symptoms that we think of as depression or anxiety. Likewise, people who have a very small natural capacity, they're much more vulnerable, can be more easily tipped into a state of having these symptoms. If they keep attending to themselves in a way that keeps this container partially filled up, they won't develop strong symptoms of these conditions. And I really believe that to be true. So my patients, a lot of them have strong family histories. They have a lot of personal history of these problems. They begin to think that it's inevitable for them. It'll be with them forever, that there's not much they can do about it. It's an illness, that kind of thing. And there's some truth in that, but at the same time, there is a great deal that they can do to change how they are at this point, but also to change the trajectory of this over time. And that's what I want to focus on. And I want to focus on this by talking about this, what I call the science of hope. So these are the three aspects of this that I'll go over in brief today. The first of these is genetic expression or gene expression. It also goes by the name epigenetics. Does anybody know what this means? Anybody want to take a crack at defining this? Gene expression. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to, but let me tell you in the way I understand it, kind of simple terms. If you see the double helix here that we all think of as our genetic material, that's the double helix DNA. And I think most of us have this notion that we've learned that we're born, or we have this given to us at conception, and then we carry it with us throughout our lives, and it's unchangeable. It just kind of stays the same throughout our lifetimes. That's how most of us have come to think about our genetics. And that is true. The double helix stays essentially the same throughout our lives. But if you look at the dark area around it, that is a combination of genetic material that has been a mystery until very recently. And because it was a mystery, it was labeled junk DNA, because it was thought to be just extra genetic stuff that had no particular purpose. It turns out it has a huge purpose. It is a series of gateways or channels, you might think of, that determine whether the information in the DNA manifests or not. So under different circumstances, different conditions, you might have the genes for an illness, but it may never get activated. It may go through your whole life and it never gets activated unless the conditions for that activation occur. Likewise, if an illness has been turned on, so to speak, it can be turned off again. It can be deactivated under the right conditions. So what we want to try to understand, and we're beginning to learn about this, is what can you do to influence that for your higher good? And there are some things that we can do. So this is what we know so far, and we are going to be learning a lot more about this in the next 5 to 10 years. But these are things that are known currently. There are some things that turn on the illness genes. And they have the bad effects on genetics. And mostly we know about these already: alcohol and tobacco, endocrine disruptors, which are usually things found in the food chain or water, things like plastics, hormones found in food, antibiotics given to animals that we eat. They affect our own genetic expression. And then finally, the effects of long-term stress has a huge impact on turning on or off these genes. Now, there's also positive modifiers, things like the bright colors in fruits and vegetables, certain kinds of exercise, and the cultivation of healthy, positive emotions. I want to just share with you one study. I just worked on a book that isn't out yet, but I finished writing it, that is a book on neuroscience and aging. So how to take care of your brain and your mind and your heart as you age. And one of the things I came across that I was just fascinated by is in this field of epigenetics is that your diet, especially as a young person, the diet that you are exposed to in your late teens or in your reproductive years, let's say, can influence at least 2 generations after you. So the food that you're exposed to, and I'll tell you how this was discovered. They looked at, in Sweden, they looked at birth records and records of famine and how much food was plentiful. And they found that if the grandfather had a great deal of food available to him in his late teens and early 20s, then his grandson was far more likely to have diabetes or heart disease or something, because it changed something in his genetic expression that got carried forward for at least 2 generations. That's just an example, but I think it's kind of intriguing for us to realize that how we choose to live our lives may in fact affect our offspring and even their offspring, and it could potentially go further than that. So, the DNA structure doesn't change for many, many generations, but how it shows up, how it's manifest, that may be influenced in a much quicker way. So diet is a really, really important piece of this. It's not the only piece, but it's a very important one. And I want to just talk for a moment about how to think about a healthy, resilient diet. There is so much conflicting information about this, huge amount of controversy about what's the right diet. My own belief is that there is no single diet that's right for everybody. Probably the closest is what's called the Mediterranean diet, but I think that everybody's made a little differently, and what's right for you might not be right for me, and so we have to think about our own bodies, our own body type, and how we respond to different foods. It's a little more nuanced. However, this is a really, really simple way to think about it. Michael Pollan, who many of you have read or know about, he says it in a really simple way. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants or mostly vegetables. Eating food is a little harder than it sounds because his definition is this has to be real food. Food that your great-grandparents would have eaten or recognized that this is food. It hasn't been changed, it hasn't been packaged, hasn't been altered, hasn't been given antibiotics or hormones in animals as they're growing. It's food in its pure form. Not too much simply means taking care to not overdo the calories. Like in the study from Sweden, presumably when they had abundant food at that age, they were eating too many calories. That's kind of what your body wants you to do when food is available. And that seems to trigger this problem with blood sugar, glucose, leading to things like diabetes, which also leads to things like depression. So thinking about this, it's a little more to it than it sounds like, but it's a very elegant way of thinking, okay, what's the simplest way I can think about how to eat healthy? These are just a very few supplements that I recommend to my patients. I take them myself from October 1st until April 1st, just because so many of us, myself included, are prone to changes in mood in the winter. And every one of these has some implication for mood. None of these are like a treatment for depression, but they're a way of helping prevent it just by helping your brain work a little better. Yes? Would you like the slides? Is that what you're saying? Oh, yeah, I can make them available. I'll just send Holly a handout with them, and then you can share them. I'm happy to have them shared. So, yeah. So basically, these are all some vitamins or supplements that have something to do with the brain being able to produce the neurotransmitters that it needs to do, the serotonin, the dopamine, the kind of things that help sustain mood and keep anxiety at bay. The second of these is what's known as neurogenesis. This is a term that probably most of you haven't heard before, and this refers to the brain's capacity to restore itself by creating new brain cells. Now, when I was in my training, in fact, I remember learning this in high school biology, so probably a lot of you have heard something similar to this, that when we're born, we have something like 100 billion brain cells, and sometime between the age of 6 to 12, your brain reaches its peak of capacity, and then as you age, you just keep losing and losing and losing a few more. And then I don't know if you remember this, but I was told that for every ounce of alcohol you drink, you're killing tens of thousands of these brain cells, and they're never coming back. Now, my youngest son just graduated from college, and they believe this because I've been telling them since they were this tall, that same story. But at that time, what we didn't know is that there are stem cells in the brain that can be turned into new neurons. Now, it is true we lose some of our brain cells as we go through life. However, there are ways in which the brain is actually able to strengthen itself and function better as we age. It's very similar to thinking about a forest with trees. Okay, so if you think about a young forest, when it's just filled with all these thousands of very small trees, but as the forest matures, it has far fewer trees, but the ones that are left are very rich. They send out all kinds of branches. They're big, they're networked. It's a very different kind of forest, but in some ways it's healthier, more resilient even, there's more capacity for wisdom. So, the aging brain is not altogether a bad thing. But the point here is that we do make new cells to replace old ones, and we do it our entire lives. This was discovered, in fact, by looking at people in the very last stages of life, because to do this kind of study, you have to wait until a person has died and then look at the brain under a microscope. And so this was done with people who were in hospice care, basically. They were in a big hospital, terminally ill, many of them elderly, and they found that even then, at the very end of their lives, their brains were making all kinds of new cells. Now, we all do this, but there are some things that allow this to work better than others. And what we want to do then, every one of us, we want to be as good as we could possibly can at having these new brain cells be healthy and vibrant and be able to connect effectively to other brain cells. That is really the key for their survival and for them functioning well. So there is a chemical, brain chemical, that goes by the acronym BDNF that functions like Miracle-Gro for your brain. So if any of you are gardeners and you have a very expensive, very nice plant that you want to put in the ground, you might want to use a root starter. A root starter makes the roots grow faster, further, there's more branches coming off of them. That's what this does to your neurons. And so you want this as much as possible, and you want it to work well. And these are some of the factors that affect how well this fertilizer works. So it is exercise, and the good news is here, it doesn't have to be very much. Low-level, non-strenuous exercise. In fact, they found that people who exercised a whole bunch, like marathoners, triathletes, they don't have as much of this brain chemical as people who do more moderate, walking, jogging, easy biking. I don't know why. That doesn't quite make sense to me, but that's what they found. Second thing is an enriched environment, which means to have lots of things that you're learning, that you're challenging your mind with, especially things that are new, like learning a new musical instrument, or a new language, or a new dance move, or something like that. Now, a lot of this research has been done with lab animals, so it's rats and mice. It's very easy to manipulate these things with lab animals, not so easy with human beings. For example, one of the biggest differences between rats and human beings is that if you put a treadmill in a rat cage, they will actually use it. They do. They just jump right on it. They run for hours a day. They just love it. Not so much for human beings, right? Diet, again, it's restricting calories, not overeating, in other words, getting the bright colors and getting plenty of omega-3. And then having enough serotonin, which is a little more complicated, but having good, healthy levels of serotonin makes this work better. And then finally, social connection. And then there's one other factor that I mentioned, but it's not on this list, and that is age. So as we age, we don't have as much of this brain chemical, but still, it's there. So which do you think, of all of these factors, which do you think is the most important for just the pure development of these brain cells? It is social connection. More important even than age, more important even than diet or exercise, it is social connection. They took a group of old rats, let them hang out with other old rats, and they did better than the youngsters who were running and eating really good and doing all the other right things. It is probably the most powerful protective aspect for mental health that we have. And it's also complicated for humans to really utilize that. But it is worth putting a great deal of attention toward. I think my computer might have just, here we go. So what I want to spend just a moment talking about here is, in regards to this, is exercise. And what I have up here is a slide about the recommendations from the Center for Disease Control about how much an adult should exercise. 2.5 hours a week, doing some strength training. If you do something vigorous, it can be just 75 minutes a week. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many American adults do you think get this much exercise? What percentage? It's about 15 to 20%. 2.5 hours a week. Now, I want to tell you a story, true story. About 7-8 years ago, I was speaking to an elder hostel group at the university. The particular group I was with, they were between 75 and 85 years old. They were a senior group. Now, this is a few years ago, but I already had gray hair, premature gray, I have to say, but still gray. And these people were probably my parents' age, or a little older maybe. We had a back and forth conversation going, and I said to them, one reason why depression is more common, I think, is because life is harder now than it used to be. Yeah, you know how that went over, right? It was not a smart move on my part. So very quickly, they said to me, in a lot of different ways, Sonny, young man, we grew up on farms. That was the interesting thing. They're all living in the Twin Cities, but at least half of the group grew up on a farm. Back in the 40s and 50s, I suppose, and they worked their butts off. That's what they pointed out, is that it was really, really hard. So I learned a couple of really important things. Don't ever tell your seniors that they had it easier than you do. And earlier generations moved their bodies a lot more than we do. So even this 2.5 hour a week suggestion is really not very good. And though they didn't exercise like we think of it, but they moved. They were working, they were standing, they were walking, bending. They were moving for 6 to 10 hours a day. I'll tell you about some research that comes out of NASA. So looking at astronauts who spend a long time in space, if they go to a space station and they're there for months, they became very concerned because these astronauts aged very quickly, much more than you'd expect. Now, they did exercises, they had routines, they ate healthy diets, they go into space, they're in great shape, and they were aging like crazy. Any ideas why that was happening? It's because they don't have gravity, not as much. They didn't have gravity to work against. And so even though they exercised and moved, they didn't have anywhere near the stress of standing and sitting and moving your body, holding your body against gravity that we do. And so they lost a lot of muscle strength and so forth. The outcome of this research is looking at us living in this day and age who sit most of the time. And I know this is true for probably most, if not all of you. It's true for me and my work. And what they find is that if you're sedentary, if you sit most of the day, even if you exercise this much, even if you do the strength training and run and all of that, it does not counter the effects of sitting all the time. What can you do instead? I'll show you. This is a picture of a physician at the Mayo Clinic. His name is James Levine. He used to weigh about 300 pounds. He's only about 5'9", 5'10". He's an endocrinologist. It wasn't a lack of knowledge about how to lose weight. He knew pretty much everything you could know about how to lose weight, but he couldn't do it because he couldn't get himself to exercise. He started to practice and study a process he calls non-exercise activated thermogenesis. Thermogenesis just means metabolism. So what he's finding is that you don't have to exercise like we think about it, you just need to be moving. So this treadmill that you see is set so low that he's not even really walking. It's just he's on it. He does his studies, or his note taking. He'll even meet with patients while he's on this, but he's just moving a little bit all the time. And you can buy one of these now. These desks are available for about $10,000. Maybe you could see if the seminary could hit for a few of these. Or you could kind of learn from this research and do something a lot cheaper, which is to simply stand up, and then you can sit right back down, but do it about 30 times a day. Standing up, and then if you want, you can stretch, you can do some squats or something, but you don't have to. You could just sit right back down about every 20 minutes. I tried this when I was working on this last book, and I thought this is going to be impossible. Interrupting my work every 20 minutes, and even though it's just briefly, I thought it'd be very disruptive. So I tried it for a while, and at first it did feel kind of disruptive, but before long, I found out that I was so much more alert and focused and had more energy, and it lasted longer. I could work actually a lot longer without getting fried, and it really worked for me. It really helped. I just set my phone alarm to go off every 20 minutes, stood up, sometimes did a little bit more, and then I would sit back down. I found I could get to where I didn't lose my train of thought. I would try it. And then the third root of resilience is to remember to rest, to remember to align with nature, is how I call it. So there's a book and a concept about stress that says that in nature, in the wild, you do not see the kind of stress-related problems that we develop as human beings. You just don't see them because they don't carry chronic stress with them. However, people do. And I do have to point out that photograph was photoshopped. I don't think it actually happened like that. But what he says is that we, meaning human beings, we have evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. What he means really is that it's because we think. We have the capacity to think, to remember, to worry, to regret, to beat ourselves up, to do all these things that the mind is creating this chronic pattern of stress. Now I want to emphasize here that stress is not the villain that we think it is. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. It's not a problem to be able to get stressed. You should get stressed at times. In fact, I would postulate that you would not want to live a life without stress. You might think you would, but you wouldn't. It would get very dull and boring, and you wouldn't grow and strengthen and so forth. Let me just give you paint a picture for you of stress as it's supposed to happen. So, picture something like this without the motorcycle, different animals, but in a similar setting, African grassland. And you see, by the way, I'm going to describe for you a little film clip that is used to help understand human trauma and how to recover from it by learning from nature. So you're watching this herd of gazelles, African gazelles, and they're just peacefully grazing on the grass. And then on the left side of your screen, all of a sudden you see a cheetah racing toward the herd. Now, all at once, the whole herd kind of crouches down and then leaps forward, and they're racing away. The cheetah sets its sights on just one poor gazelle and is chasing it down. And at first, you think, well, this gazelle is really fast. It's going to get away. But the cheetah's faster and more determined and just kind of keeps gaining, and before long, leaps on the back of the gazelle, pulls it down to the ground, and its body goes stiff. And you're looking at it and you're quite sure it's just been killed. It actually hasn't been killed. It has gone into a freeze response. This is what mammals do, including us. If fight and flight don't work, you automatically freeze. The idea is similar to when you're a kid and you play dead, and you hope that whoever's chasing you won't see you. It's kind of like that, except you're not thinking about it, it just happens automatically, in the hopes that the predator, whoever's chasing, will lose interest and leave you alone because they don't want a dead animal. Well, sure enough, you keep watching, the cheetah gets up and it walks away and you don't see it again. The gazelle is laying there, still thinking, I'm thinking it's dead, and then it starts to move a little bit, starts to shake slightly, and then it gets up slowly on its knees and it's wobbly, then it gets up on all fours and it's even more wobbly, you think it's going to fall over. And then something really strange happens. That gazelle starts to shake its whole body violently, shaking like mad, as if, it's trying to shake its skin off or something. And it goes on for a long time, 2 or 3 minutes. What's happening, apparently, is that this is nature's way of getting rid of the stress hormones. It gets all the lactic acid out of the muscles. It's like resetting the whole system from this terror that it just went through. It's shaking it off, quite literally. Now, after it stopped shaking, what struck me as the strangest thing of all happened. It stopped shaking, and then the gazelle walks back to the rest of the herd as if none of this had happened. It looks as peaceful and calm as it could possibly be. That is stress as it's supposed to be. We're not supposed to carry it with us. Now, there's a couple things happening here that I just want to emphasize in terms of how it's supposed to happen. If you were measuring the stress hormones, you would find within a second after recognizing the threat, adrenaline shoots up, makes you very strong, very alert, ready to fight or run. And then it can stay high for maybe 30 to 45 minutes, and that's about it. And then the adrenaline starts to fade. You cannot sustain super high levels of adrenaline for very long. But there's a second stress hormone that comes up in a few minutes. It takes a while to rise, and it'll stay high for about a day. That's cortisol. It's doing 3 very important things for survival. 1, it makes you hungry so that you want to restore your energy reserves. 2nd is it makes you tired so that you want to rest. If you were watching this gazelle for the rest of the day, basically it would just be eating and sleeping, recovering itself. That's what we ought to be doing when we've gone through a period of high stress, but only for a while. The 3rd thing that it does, cortisol pushes the memory button in your brain, the hippocampus. The reason for that is so that you will remember what you've just experienced in order not to encounter it again. It's survival. You don't want to go through this again, so you darn well want to remember, how did you get into this mess? That is really helpful for a short time. But imagine that cortisol doesn't come down after a day like it should, but it stays high for weeks or months or even years. It is making you eat and gain weight, especially in the middle of the body, which is very hard to recover from because it makes even more stress hormones. It kind of perpetuates itself. It makes you very tired and unfocused, and it messes with your memory center, because if you're constantly pushing the memory button, some of those cells die and the memory center shrinks, hippocampus shrinks. After writing this book on aging, I am convinced that stress is one of the primary causes of dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other brain diseases that occur as we age, because it puts such pressure on those parts of the brain. So the other aspect of this kind of nature and resetting ourselves is to rest, and the most obvious way to do that is to sleep. The average amount of sleep in our culture is about 6 hours, maybe 6.5. I don't know what it is in seminary, but college students, it's probably 5 or 6 hours, but they're also all over the map. Some nights sleeping 0 or 1 or 2 hours, the next night maybe catching up, sleeping 10 to 12 or more hours. That's really hard on the body. Much better to get up at about the same time every day, even if you've stayed up late, take a short nap later in the day, but keep your circadian rhythms on track. And then the reminder that hopefully you don't need, but we as a culture need, and that is to remember that we need time, not just to rest, but also to turn inward, to remember that we're part of something larger than ourselves, to connect with something more meaningful, hopefully with some sort of community that shares that kind of meaning. And I just share my own experience. I grew up in a rural area in northern Iowa, and when I grew up, Sunday was a day that, for a kid, not much was going on. And now, that is not so true anymore. All kinds of things get scheduled, and you and your field, your profession, you have a lot of things to kind of work against with trying to keep people reminded that the Sabbath has real value. So I know that we're almost out of time. I'm going to just close with a story and then if we have time, I'll just share one other neuroscience piece. So the story is about a little boy. It's a Native American story. And it's about a little boy who was visiting his grandfather, who was a tribal elder and a spiritual leader. So the boy is about 4 years old. He adores his grandfather. He's spending a couple weeks visiting him, and he just follows him like a shadow. So he learns very quickly that his grandfather has a pattern to his life. Every morning at about sunrise, his grandfather goes into his living room. He sits down in front of his little altar. He takes off a necklace, places it on the altar, closes his eyes for a few minutes, puts the necklace back on, and he goes about his day. Every evening at around sunset, he does the same thing. Within a few days, the little boy is so curious. He says, "Grandfather, what are you doing? And what is this necklace you keep putting off and on?" So the grandfather takes the necklace off. He holds it out in his hand, shows it to the boy, and it's a silver medallion that has 2 wolf heads on it. Grandfather says, "This is to remind me that inside every one of us, there are 2 wolves. One of them is angry and selfish and really just cares about himself and the tribe, whereas the other one is kind and generous and really cares about others at least as much as himself. And these 2 wolves," he says, "are fighting a great battle." The boy is young enough, he's taking this very literally, his eyes are wide, and he says, "Grandfather, which one will win?" And the grandfather says, "It's the one we feed the most. It's the one we feed the most. So I'm feeding the good wolf when I quiet myself, close my eyes." The neuroscience piece, and I will end with this and let you go, but it's been known for a few years, about 10 years, that there's a part of the brain that sits right behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex. And it's got 2 little centers, 2 little nuclei, one on each side. There's a left and a right. And they have very different functions. When the left prefrontal cortex is more active, you're in a state kind of like the good wolf. You're open, you're willing to put yourself forth in the world, you're able to connect with people, you have a sense of compassion for others, you're not self-absorbed. When the right-hand side is more active, it's the opposite. It's like the bad wolf. You're contracted. You feel self-absorbed. You ruminate a lot. You feel hostile. And I'm going to share 2 quick studies about this that point out how important it is that we're feeding the good wolf. First study was to look at teenage boys who were playing a video game, a violent video game. Not extreme, but it was so common that 95% of kids at that time were playing it. It was a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And they had these boys play this video game while they're under this equipment. They measured their prefrontal cortex activity. No big surprise. When they're playing this video game, the right side gets active. They're in a state of hostility, self-absorption, contraction. The surprising part, which should give us some pause, was that they asked those boys for 1 week not to play this or any other video game. They brought them back into the lab, they measured it, and it was stuck. It was stuck in that position. It had not gone back to baseline. That, I think, is concerning. If we're putting into our minds, if we're having those kind of inputs repeatedly, we're practicing putting ourselves into that kind of state, it is not good for us. And it is certainly not good for someone who has a tendency toward depression or anxiety, because it does not feel good to be in that kind of state. The second study was done at the University of Wisconsin with Buddhist monks who had been practicing compassion meditation for decades. And they gave them an assignment. They showed them a picture of a little baby that was deformed, had a deformed skull. And they said, look at this picture and fill yourself with compassion for this child. Within seconds, they're able to activate this left prefrontal cortex. I say this not because, just because there's virtue in doing that, but because if you're working with somebody that struggles with depression, anxiety, getting stuck in this state of rumination is just horrible. And if you can practice opening it up, it gives you some emotional freedom. It's good to be compassionate for others, but one of the reasons it's good is because it feels a whole lot better for you. It's a lot better for yourself. So I'll leave you with 2 lines from a Rumi poem that I think points to this and kind of summarizes in a way, summarizes the human existence. Half of any person is wrong and weak and off the beaten path. Half. The other half is dancing and laughing and swimming in the invisible joy. So thank you very much.
We have time for a little. If you need to go, you may go with blessing. And whoever has, we will stay for a little bit for questions. You have. Oh, the one thing. They want the one thing. That's right. Good. They want the one thing.
Is my mic on? I will tell you the one thing. I'm going to go forward in my slides here a little bit. I did promise, after all, didn't I? So there is one thing we can do, and the happiest people are those who can do it to the limit of their ability. We can be completely present. We can be all here. We can give all our attention to the opportunity before us.
Incarnational ministry. Being who God has created us to be in ministry. Are there any persons that have any questions?
Or comments.
Or comments Do you, anybody? Yes? Anything here? Okay. Well, he's available to stay after a little bit if you don't want to ask it in front of the large group, and let's thank him again for his time. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
Just wanted to make two quick announcements. One, in the bookstore, we have both of Dr. Emmons' titles, Chemistry of Calm and Chemistry of Joy, and the workbook. So please check those out. They're in the bookstore. Secondly, as you came in, you received this sheet. And this is just some follow-up from today as we think about the ways in which we can replenish our resiliency, our supply. These are some ways to help you think about what goes on here at Luther and what might be some opportunities we want to pursue this coming year. But also just kind of add, we're hoping to bring back Dr. Emmons or someone from his Partners in Resilience on this winter to maybe do a more focused session on mindfulness. So if that's something of interest, please mark it down because we want to hear your thoughts and suggestions. So let's please join me as we again thank Dr. Emmons for his time here.